Hi there, I'm your host Marlene McConnell and welcome to the Surviving Trauma Stories of Hope podcast. In this week's episode, I'm happy to welcome the lovely Lisa Ford from her home in Pennsylvania. Lisa is a multi-skilled counselor, therapist, and educator with a career spanning more than 20 years in the field of psychology and education. She blends her career experiences with life experience to deliver a message of hope, growth, and a tell it like it is reality. She now works as a psychoeducational consultant, speaker, writer, and social influencer, advocating for the need to take control of your trauma before your trauma takes control of you. Lisa was the product of a child rearing of a mentally ill parent and had a first-hand look at the experiences involved with the pandemic and the mental crises when she left the field of education to support her daughter who underwent a mental health breakdown. Lisa is in the unique position to bring attention to the importance of creating mental health awareness and mental health advocacy from the perspective of a former school counselor, trauma survivor, and mother of a trauma survivor. She combines her experience in education and clinical therapy to create a new perspective in providing mental health coaching, psychotherapy, and goal setting for a better future. This episode discusses Lisa's childhood struggles raised by a mentally ill parent, her personal journey supporting her daughter with a learning disability and mental health diagnoses, changing careers, coping with mental health and learning disabilities, a guide for parents and companies who work with schools, and so much more. It has been my pleasure having Lisa join me, and I know my listeners, you will love this episode. Thank you again for joining me on this journey. Comment on the post on Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn and let me know what you think of this episode. Also head to Amazon.com or Takealot.com and get your copy of my book, Ray of Light, and please leave me a rating and review. It would mean so much to me. Also, please check out my website and download your free journal prompt and relaxing meditation on the resources page. As always, stay tuned and keep listening. Welcome, Lisa. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I am great. Thank you, Marlene, for having me.
It's wonderful. I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Absolutely.
So I absolutely want our listeners just to get to know you a little bit. And I want them to get to know you because it's great to see how your upbringing really plays a big role in the work that you do today and in mental health awareness and mental health advocacy. Now, you were raised by a mentally ill parent and also a parent trying to rediscover herself after escaping the effects of being with someone who was mentally ill.
Correct.
Can you share with us what that experience was like for you growing up?
So basically, I was raised by a father who was mentally ill, bipolar, schizophrenic. And with that, I did not know who I was going to see from time to time. If I was going to see the loving father who was receptive and wanted to take me to the playground and was interested in spending lots of time with me, or I was going to see someone who was lost in their head and seeing what he saw and reading what he read and feeling what he felt. And for a long time, it was very confusing as a child because he would try to teach me to see what he saw, hear what he heard, and feel what he felt. And as a child wanting to just believe in their parent, I wanted to believe all of that. I wanted to understand all of that. But as a rational individual and as someone who was raised by a mother who was not mentally ill, I also realized that what he was saying just didn't make sense and didn't hold full logic.
So I know that you did some research to try to understand what your dad was trying to explain to you at the time and also understand more about his illness. How did that help you to adjust?
So for years, I was an acting out teenager, tension-seeking teenager. I wasn't diagnosed with ODD, but I'm pretty sure I had ODD, oppositional defiant disorder. I wanted to fight the world. I fought it a lot in my poetry. I fought it in an inner city environment. I was angry at everything, angry at everyone. I was angry at my mother, who had finally escaped his emotional toxicity. And I took a lot of it out on her. And she wanted to sort of rediscover herself. So it was a long period of really lashing out. And I did have the support of my mom and a lot of people around me. And I eventually did find a relationship that sort of took the place of the seeking, I guess, the seeking of love that I was looking from my father. And that was with someone who was a little bit older than I should have been with, and someone who I eventually married and had a relationship with and had children with and all of those things. And I still continued a lot of those patterns of the anger and the toxicity and things like that. And I think it wasn't until I actually went to start to study psychology. I happened to be in a class that was family and couple dynamics, and I started to realize the patterns. I started to recognize what I was, in fact, continuing as far as the patterns that have been put into my life. And I wanted to understand more of how to stop those patterns and how to counteract those patterns. And I went to a lot of years of therapy. And the therapy a lot of times was about dealing with my emotions and processing things. But it wasn't until I got older and I started wanting to leave this toxic relationship and sort of see things from a different perspective that one of my therapists said something that was very pivotal to me, in that you sometimes get more power from not reacting to a situation than reacting to a situation. So I started to understand that my violent tendencies and my anger was not getting me anywhere, but was just perpetuating a cycle.
Yeah. And so eventually, getting rid of this anger, did you only do this through therapy, or did you have some kind of rituals that you practiced in order to really let that go? Because, I mean, if we leave anger just to fester, it can easily turn into resentment toward your dad, resentment toward your mom, resentment toward work, the world. How did you
Yes.
finally rid yourself of that deep-seated anger?
Well, one of the big things I did was write poetry. I've always been a writer. I took a lot of that anger, a lot of that feeling, and I put it onto paper. And I would continue to read my own and understand a little bit more about my emotions. So, one of the things I tell my clients when they're lost in their emotions and not understanding is that they need to sort of get that information out of their brains, out of their minds, and put it on paper so they can understand what it is that they're struggling with. So I became avid in writing poetry and in writing in general. And
Yeah,
with my mother's
I
support,
love that.
thank you. And with my mother's support, I continued on to college. And with college, I decided to go into education. And I generally worked in urban inner city backgrounds because I felt as if I could relate to a lot of the toxicity and the anger that the individuals, the students that I was coming in contact with, were dealing with. And I think in helping them to process their feelings, I was able to work through my own.
Yes. So now, I mean, as a mom of two, right? You're working as an
Three,
educator. Oh, three.
three.
Okay, forgive me.
Mm-hmm.
So, as a mom of three,
Nope, no
yeah.
problem.
So as a mom of three, you worked as an educator, and you've managed to help so many within this urban environment. But it also came close to home for you when your daughter struggled with a mental health crisis. And this would ultimately lead you to a change in career from educator to therapist. So, given your experience, how did that equip you to help your daughter through her mental health crisis?
Yeah, it was very difficult. Before I get to that piece, I will get to that piece, but I just want to mention that as an educator, when I was 20 years in education, I started to see so many other kids struggle with their mental health. And with that, then I moved to school counselor. So I think it's important for me to just talk about the fact that I was a school counselor when these things were happening. So I moved to school counselor, and I started to understand that there were underlying pieces that affect the academics and that affect all sorts of things. So by the time the pandemic came about, and by the time my daughter started to struggle with her mental health difficulties, and I did have, a lot of my children, a lot of my students, so many people were struggling with mental health difficulties, and the pandemic really brought them out. I think I was skilled enough and aware enough to then be able to help in a different way. But when it hit home, it did trigger a lot of what I went through as a child. And it did bring me into a lot of reminders of what I went through as a child. But with that, I had to take responsibility. My ex-husband and I both had to take responsibility for the toxicity that we brought into the home. And we had to use all that we had to sort of apologize and walk our child through it, and to understand that it was okay to have these emotions, and that this was my child who was a pleaser all of her life and wanted to make everyone happy and make everything good and make everything perfect. And when she started to spin out of control, her idea was that I am becoming too much on you, so I need to take myself out of the picture. So we needed to take a lot of personal responsibility for the fact that our marriage was a big culprit of not just hers, but a lot of, the things that my children went through. And I started to understand that the biggest thing I had to say to her was, it's not that you want to die, it's that you don't want to be in pain. And the pain was the source of it. And it became to the point where I had to work through helping her to get through the pain. And as I did that, I was still helping my own students because I was still working full time from many of the hospitals and things like that I was at, to understand the source of their pain. And it became difficult to work in a school setting where I had to focus on post-secondary guidance, where I had to focus on grades, where I had to focus on, the drama that existed in the school, when I was so focused on the mental health aspects of what these kids were going through. So I worked through what I needed to work through with my daughter. And simultaneously, the school that I was working at, which was a Catholic school, had to close its doors. We had some financial difficulties and the diocese decided to close us. So I had a choice of whether to stay in the educational setting or to make a transition into therapy. And it seemed to be the right fit for me, for my daughter, for my other children, and just in general, for me to move from education to therapy, to clinical counseling. And so that's where I went with that.
Right. And how is your daughter doing now if we think it's 3-4 years later?
So it's 2020 is when it happened. So yeah, I guess it is 3 years later. She's doing well. There's been some, mental health diagnoses, and we've understood that some of the things that continue in our family have continued on. But I have worked with her a lot to understand that her diagnosis does not have to be something that's a detriment, but can also be something that's a catalyst for change and a catalyst for empowerment.
Are you comfortable to share the diagnosis with us?
I'd rather not.
Okay. Okay.
I'd rather not.
No problem.
But I can say that my daughter is in a place where she is starting to move on. I did have to understand where she was. I mean, she does have an educational diagnosis as well as a psychological diagnosis. So her educational diagnosis, she was dyslexic, OCD. So a lot of those pieces of that. And then she has a psychological diagnosis. And with her psychological diagnosis and her educational diagnosis, I had to fight really hard for people to see the connection between the two, between the learning disabilities and the mental health. And I continue to see that pattern until today in many clients I deal with, whether they be adolescents or adults, where because trauma has been involved, because mental health has been involved, because there's been family dynamics of toxicity, that has been the focus where learning disabilities have been missed. And in the reverse, because of learning disabilities
Yeah.
and because of, what was seen in the school setting, that has been the focus. And then the mental health piece was not recognized. So I'm a big advocate of psychoeducational
Yeah.
counseling in the sense that I believe that it's important to understand not just the mental health piece of it and not just the educational piece of it, but how the two coincide. So I'm very strong in believing that instead of hiding our diagnosis and hiding it behind there, which I guess is kind of ironic for me to say that in the sense that I don't want to talk about her diagnosis, but she's an adolescent. I can talk about my own in the sense that I was oppositional defiant, that I'm major depressive disorder, that I struggle with anxiety and depression. I can talk about my own. I just don't feel it's right to do it with an adolescent.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But with doing so, I feel like it's important to recognize where we are and to not hide those things behind the skeletons in the closet per se. I think it's important to recognize our
Yeah.
situation, to learn about it, to understand it. And that way we can take a hold of that and use that to build us to a much better person, and to use that to move us into a direction where we not only empower ourselves and understand ourselves, but we can then help another individual.
Lisa, thank you so much for just sharing all of that with us and just being so transparent with your experiences. It's so refreshing to hear that. It's so refreshing to have somebody say, I break the stigma with the way that I speak about
Thank you.
these difficult issues such as mental health, and I'm an advocate for being more transparent about your situation. So thank you so much for that. I want to talk just about, I first
Thank
of all
you.
want to commend you on the change in career. I understand how it was, a natural fit for you. But you now have a consultancy business that, as you mentioned, focuses on psychoeducation. It's very interesting for me bringing the mental health aspect and the education together. And you help parents to navigate mental health, not only for themselves, but also for their kids.
True.
Please
Absolutely.
tell us more about your work and how you can help parents through your organization.
Sure. So now, with my experience in education and my experience in therapy, and as a lifelong survivor and a mother of someone of a lifelong survivor, I feel that I've reached a certain level of understanding as to why it's important to recognize learning disabilities, why it's important to understand mental health diagnoses at an early age. And what I try to do is to help parents to understand where their own children are in regards to the learning disability, in regards to the mental health diagnosis, in regards to the trauma that the child went through or had to experience, to then take a hold of all of those aspects and use them to empower the child to want to grow and to move into a direction that fits the diagnosis, that fits the child's ability level, that fits the child's understanding of where he or she wants to go, and to also work with the parent to understand what this diagnosis, whether it be the learning disability or the mental health diagnosis, what it actually means in the sense of their understanding of where their child was going to go versus where their child has the ability to go versus what they need to understand about how their life plan for their child needs to move into a different direction. I think it's important that we learn to meet our children where they're at.
And that's so important. In my experience, it's difficult for parents when they receive these diagnoses about their children. And sometimes it's difficult for them to accept that. And they do try to place these children still in a mainstream environment, for lack of a better word,
Absolutely.
rather than to actually accept, and like you pointed out, accept a plan that is more suited for the diagnosis that can help the child grow into a well-balanced individual. And so I'm glad that you also spend the time with the parents in order to help them to adjust to the situation as much as it's difficult for the child. The change, it's also very hard and difficult for the parents when they get the diagnosis of their child. I mean, every parent wants the best for their child, so thank you for creating this space for psychoeducation and bringing these two together.
Absolutely.
So when you have a child with mental health issues, it takes, like I mentioned, the toll on the parents. So what guidance can you provide to parents to look after their mental health?
Well, the first thing the parent needs to do is get support. So the school is the best source of support. I think they need to be open with the school in the sense that they talk to the school counselor or the school social worker and get the support they need there. I think that they also need to reach out to a therapist to get their own level of therapy to see if there's a support group that exists for them. I think one of the big things that helped me through a lot of what I went through with my daughter was that I was a counselor. I was someone who was helping other individuals. So I understood a lot of it, but I wasn't a therapist at that point in time. I had 20 years of therapy, but I wasn't a therapist at that time. So I didn't understand necessarily what it meant to process emotions. I didn't understand some of the pieces in therapy that I needed to understand. There were crossovers for sure, but when I had a child who was showing mental health difficulties, I would get them to a certain point and then I would refer out. Now I am the person that they refer to. So it's a different, level of responsibility in a different role. And I did want to mention that not only do I work with the parents, but I also want to work with the organizations and the educational institutions, because many of the educators and the teachers do not understand still the connections of the underlying implications of learning disabilities and mental health diagnoses and how they present in the classroom. So often behavioral displays of anger and rejection and withdrawal and things like that are often seen as a discipline issue. And in return, there's a reason why it becomes a discipline issue. But there is generally that behavioral display is generally a way of covering up some source of pain that exists behind it. And I truly believe that in any case, whether we're talking education, social, parental situation, one of the big questions that we need to ask is, why is this behavior being displayed? Instead of my kid is, getting in fights. My child is becoming sexually promiscuous. My child is, dabbling in drugs. There is always a why behind it. And in addition to educating the parents and working with the child, I think it's also important that the educational institutions start to understand that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's a necessary piece of it for schools to do professional developments and workshops to understand when you see this level of behavior being displayed, what you're supposed to do. I mean, there were situations where, like, my child didn't want to get dressed in a dressing room in gym, and the gym teacher simply gave her an F and didn't ask, well, why didn't she want to change? Why was she having difficulties? Well, there were issues of self-harm. And if someone would have looked into that and found that, then maybe we could have gotten to a different situation before this breakdown happened. And with the breakdown, we were
Yeah.
at a place where educationally there was a lot of
Yeah.
withdrawal. There was a lot of change. There was a lot of things going on that I think the educators could have noticed things beforehand before it went in that direction.
Right.
And in working with my own students in my school setting, a lot of times because of
Yeah.
confidentiality, because of FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and I had to keep things private, I could not tell
Right.
teachers some of the things that were going on in the class. So when a teacher would come to me and say, this one is getting Fs, or this one is not doing this, or this one is not doing that, I could not say that there were issues of rape. I could not say that there were issues of abuse. I could not say certain things that were going on. So it was very difficult. I was in a very difficult position because I was supposed to be focusing on the post-secondary needs of my students. Yet I was dealing with so many mental health, traumatic, and learning disability crossovers. So it was a very difficult thing. And in the sense that school counselors cannot reveal that type of information, I think it's necessary that there are professional developments and trainings available to make these individuals understand the displays of behaviors that they see in the classroom and why that's important to hone in on that before it starts to really spiral out of control. Because attention seeking behaviors are just that. They're attention seeking, stating, I need your attention because I'm dealing with some source of pain that you're not recognizing. And I'm going to show this to anyone and everyone until they understand this source of pain, until either I get the help I need or I implode.
That's amazing work that you do. And I'm so glad that, you are that beacon of light and hope and education for individuals, parents, and also, schools. If we can reach the children, the younger and the sooner they are diagnosed, there's more hope for them developing into well-balanced individuals.
Absolutely.
You also help parents to navigate a IEP or a 504 plan. And I've only recently learned about a 504 plan
Correct.
for children that have learning disabilities. Can you explain what a 504 plan is and what guidance you have for parents?
So the IEP comes from IDEA, which is the Individual Disability Educational Act. And that is a legal mandate in which all of the accommodations and modifications that are put into place are then put into place for the success of the child. Whereas when you have an IEP, it could be something like an SLD diagnosis, which is specific learning disability. It could be a speech disability. It could be a visual impairment. It could be, there's so many different areas. One of the other areas it could be is emotional disturbance. And I have a real problem with that diagnosis, but that's anything related to mental health or impairing the normal understanding of the child. So, and I hate the word normal as well.
Right.
So that is through the IDEA. That's an IEP. A 504 is a little different because a 504 doesn't come from the IDEA. It comes from the rehabilitation services and the state. It is something where it is a plan created to assist the child, but it doesn't have the same level of mandate. Something that goes with a 504 could be more like OHI, which is other health impaired. The accommodations and modifications are put in there in the same sense, but it just doesn't come from the same legal justification as an IDEA and an IEP comes from. So sometimes within a 504, a school can put that into place and they can sort of be a little less rigid on what they put in there as accommodations and modifications. So an IEP is definitely something that holds more weight and more merit. And that can travel on with a child when they move into college or something along those lines. So I work with the parents in understanding the difference there. Also, even with having an IEP, an individualized educational plan, there are accommodations and modifications put into play, but they are not always enough. They're not always enforced. They're not always done the way they're supposed to be. So a teacher or an educator, and I was a teacher for 20 years, so I'm not saying anything negative against teachers, but a teacher has 30 some students in a classroom at like a given time, and usually several classes of those 30 some. And within that bracket of students, it has now been diagnosed that it's now been proven that there are 1 in 6 who have mental health disabilities, and 33% of the students who have
Right.
learning disabilities. So with that, that's a whole lot of balance,
Yes.
to understand how to do that from a teacher's perspective, to hit this person's accommodations and this person's modifications and this person's this. So it's a lot. And I understand that. However, that's not my job to worry about how they're going to implement it. My job is to make sure that that child is then receiving all the accommodations and modifications that child is supposed to receive. And that the lesson plans that are put into effect are in fact abiding by those accommodations and modifications. And that the parent, in fact, is educated enough to understand what the child is deserving or warranted to receive to advocate for their own child. So there's a lot to it. It takes a lot of understanding.
Definitely. Yeah, Lisa, I mean, thank you. I did not realize that there was a difference between an IEP and a 504 plan.
Yes.
I honestly thought that it was a different way of referring to the same plan that is put in place as different learning modules or alternative learning modules for a child with learning disabilities or mental health issues. So thank you very much for clarifying that.
You're welcome.
And the IEP plan seems to be the one that really holds down the weight. Can I ask, the IEP or the 504 plan, when this is implemented, it's implemented in all schools? Is it sort of like public schools, private schools, specialized schools? Can it be implemented sort of across the board, or is this something that is particularly focused only on one type of school?
So the IEP generally goes into a public school setting. The reason being is that's where a special education, there's generally a child studies special education setting there where the IEP is there. If you're in a private school setting or a parochial setting or something along those lines, generally there is a contracted company that comes in, such as something like Catapult Services. They come in and they help to implement the plans. And there's usually like a contact person there who works with them. And generally it's called a service plan versus being an individualized educational plan. So it's a little different. And it has to be that the school implements it. So generally the situation that occurs is that a child demonstrates a behavior, whether it be a lack of focus, whether it be difficulty in understanding, phonics concerns, whatever it may be, the child demonstrates that behavior. That behavior is then noticed by someone, an educator or parent or whomever. Then there's a process of psychological identification. So there's a psychological evaluation that is done to then have a school psychologist or an outside psychologist or
Yeah.
psychiatrist give a classification. Then after that is done, a child study team is put together to sit down and work with the educators, the parents, the diagnosis, and come up with the plan. Now, that works in a setting where child study is put into play. We're used to dealing with it. People are there. They understand that. But how many
Mm-hmm.
inner city, urban, how many, poverty stricken areas are not discovered? So I was just doing some statistical work. I was trying to do some research to see how many adults have learning disabilities at this point in time that were never discovered. And it looks like there's roughly 60% of adults are individuals who show literacy issues who have learning disabilities that were never discovered. And what I am finding as a therapist,
At least as a US statistic.
correct, I apologize. It's a US statistic, and I can give you where I got the statistic from. I don't have it on this exact moment, but that was yesterday's discovery. And my guess is that it's probably higher in many countries, many poverty-stricken countries and things along those lines.
Yeah.
So with that said,
And I mean, we see that. We see that though, Lisa. We see adults even now saying, I think I was probably not diagnosed, but this is what I think I have. Or we find
exactly.
Adults now, even celebrities as adults now coming out and saying, I was recently diagnosed with this and I just thought I was really hyper as a child. And so I definitely can see how that statistic is very accurate.
And that's my next thought, basically, is that now, and as a therapist. So firstly, I have left working with the age range of 14 to 18 for a while, although some of my clients are now starting to get older, because I was dealing with so much self-harm and suicidal ideations and things along those lines. And it was too triggering for me at this moment, so I moved to work with more adults. And ironically, a lot of the adults I'm working with are in their early 20s. So it's sort of like the same age that I've worked with, but they're just sort of grown up. And I do have a 20-year-old. So it's sort of that age. It's interesting how it's just sort of parallels. But anyway, I'm working with a lot of these students or adults at this point in time. That's one of the biggest things I'm finding is undiagnosed learning disabilities. And with those undiagnosed learning disabilities, what I'm finding is failure to thrive and failure to transition. And I'm dealing with many individuals who have sensory perception disorder and sensory processing issues. I'm dealing with many individuals who have borderline agoraphobia, where they don't want to leave the house. They have difficulty with the anxiety of being in a regular working setting. These are the individuals who were supposed to graduate in 2020 or 2021 and have that big graduation and have that big prom and have all of those things and lost all those major milestones due to the pandemic.
Yeah.
And since the pandemic, are now struggling with trying to understand how to fit in the society and how to transition from childhood to adulthood, and somehow got lost there because of the lack of understanding of their learning disabilities, their lack of understanding of where their mental health diagnosis was, and just overall their attention seeking was missing because they needed some sort of help or some sort of processing. And now as adults, they're going, I don't know what to do. Help me figure out how to be an adult.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that connects with education, and psychology. And I think my biggest mission is to create that psychoeducational balance and letting people understand there is a connection between the two. And if we want our children to maximize their potential, if we want our children to earn all that's, due to them, whether it be social understanding or academic success or, just functioning as a normal individual in a society, we have to recognize some of those underlying implications that are causing our children such pain, discomfort, and anxiety. I think if we look at how many people are struggling with anxiety, it's shocking.
Yeah, I think we need a follow-up episode to explore more about how you help the young adults transition, because I think that is also an important discussion to have. And all of these things that you've mentioned, like the self-harm, the suicidal thoughts, the high levels of anxiety, those are things that I have heard come up quite frequently, and the statistics are actually quite scary if you look at them. So I think doing that transitional work for somebody that perhaps their diagnosis wasn't caught earlier on, it helps. I think if you know through a diagnosis, it's easier to navigate. And I think it's easier to own that.
Absolutely.
Lisa, do you have any last words of inspiration that you want to leave the audience with?
I think the biggest thing that I want anyone to think about is when they see behavioral displays of something, if there's any questions of this is different or, what is going on here, there's always a why behind it. And it's our job, whether we are parents, teachers, friends, educators, spouses, whatever may be, to help that person discover what is the why, so then they can help to get to the source of why the behavior is being displayed.
Okay. I think first of all, it's important to know that it's the behavior that is the tell, and then to ask that question. Thank you. Those are really wise words.
Yes.
Lisa, if the listeners would like to work with you, how do they contact you?
My website is www.causeandeffecttraumahealing.com. My email is lford, like the car, FORD, at causeandeffecttraumahealing.com.
Perfect. I am going to also link that in the show notes. So if anybody would like to work with you, then they can. Lisa, thank you so much for joining me today and helping parents and their children navigate the marshlands of mental health. It's been such a pleasure having you, and thank you for educating and your vulnerability and sharing so selflessly with us. And listeners, if you are interested in working with Lisa, please check out her website, which I will link in the show notes below. And Lisa, thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Marlene. I appreciate the time and opportunity to work with you.
You're very welcome. That wraps up this podcast episode. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy my podcast, please take a minute to give me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast directory so you don't miss an episode. Please consider following My Centered Life on Facebook and Instagram for daily inspiration. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. You can catch me again in the next episode, same time, same place. Sending you lots of love and light. Bye.